On a bright winter morning in Wyoming, Sergeant Callum Rourke found a young German shepherd trembling beneath his police cruiser. He thought the dog needed warmth, food, and a way back to whoever had lost him. Then Marlow responded to a hand signal, carried Callum's duty glove, and stayed close whenever an old memory tightened Callum's breathing. The answers eventually led to Second Watch, a training center Callum had spent years pretending meant nothing to him. But returning Marlow would force Callum to face a harder truth. The dog was not the only one who had been waiting for him to come back. Somewhere in Callum's phone was a number he had refused to call for 14 months. Share your own touching story about an animal you love, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. The blizzard reached North Ember just before dark. By 6 in the evening, the road beyond Callum Rourke's house had nearly disappeared beneath wind-driven snow. The wooden fence along the property line showed only its upper rail in places, and the pines behind the house bent and straightened beneath heavy white gusts. Callum stood at the kitchen counter with one hand wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. The police radio sat beside the sink. He was not supposed to be working. The department had put him on restricted duty months ago, and Chief Warner had called that afternoon to make the message clear. "Stay home, Sergeant. We've got enough people closer to town." Callum had answered, "Understood." Then he had turned the radio on anyway. Old habits did not disappear because someone signed a medical form. Dispatch traffic moved steadily through the small kitchen. A stalled snowplow near County Route 9, a power line down on Alder Street, 2 motorists stranded outside the western limits. No major injuries, no reason for Callum to leave the house. Still, every time the radio crackled, his blue-gray eyes shifted toward it. The house had once felt like a good decision. It stood beyond the last cluster of homes on North Ember's eastern edge, where the town gave way to grazing land and pine forest. After the crash, Callum had told everyone he needed somewhere quiet while his knee healed. For a while, quiet had sounded like medicine. 14 months later, it felt different. Quiet had become the place where nobody could ask how he was doing. Callum set the mug down. A sudden metallic crack sounded outside. He looked toward the back door. Another sharp slap followed. Then another. Callum knew what it was. A tarp-covered emergency equipment in the rear of the older police cruiser parked beside the house. The department had allowed him to keep the vehicle during restricted duty because he still handled administrative calls, welfare checks, and occasional transport work when cleared. The wind must have torn a corner loose. He considered ignoring it. Another violent slap hit the cruiser. Callum's jaw tightened. Fine. He pulled on a dark forest green quilted jacket over his faded navy thermal shirt, stepped into weathered black boots, and slipped gloves over his hands. His black digital watch caught briefly on the jacket cuff. The scratched face flashed 6:17. He opened the door. Cold struck him immediately. Snow rushed across the porch in pale sheets. Callum lowered his head and stepped outside. His right knee stiffened before he reached the stairs. The first step sent a familiar ache along the joint. Callum paused, shifted more weight onto his left leg, then continued. The cruiser sat less than 30 yards from the house, but the storm compressed distance. Porch light faded behind him after only a few steps. The tarp snapped again. Metal against metal. For half a second, the yard vanished. There was a road instead. Black ice, red and blue light spinning across a windshield. Daniel beside him saying something Callum could no longer remember clearly. A pickup moving sideways through an intersection. Then the hard, impossible sound of impact. Callum stopped walking. His breathing had changed. He stared at the cruiser, not the old one. This one, the one in his driveway. He forced his eyes downward. "Fence," he said quietly. Snow pressed against his boots. Porch light. His breath steamed in front of his face. Cruiser. He flexed his gloved fingers. Snow. The world settled back into place. Callum walked the remaining distance and reached the rear quarter panel. The loose corner of the tarp whipped toward him. He caught it, pulled it tight, and fought the rope through a metal eyelet with numb fingers. The wind shoved at his shoulders. Callum braced himself against the vehicle. He tied the knot twice. The tarp stopped moving. Silence did not return. Nothing was silent in a Wyoming blizzard. Wind moved through the pines like distant surf, but the sharp metallic slapping was gone. Callum remained beside the cruiser for a moment, breathing slowly. His knee throbbed. He wanted the house, the chair near the stove, the radio low enough to pretend he was not listening. He turned. Something made a sound beneath the wind. Callum stopped. It was so faint he wondered if he had imagined it. He waited. Nothing. Then it came again, a thin, uneven whine. Callum looked toward the trees. "Hello?" The word disappeared immediately into the storm. Another whine came from much closer. Callum lowered his gaze toward the cruiser. He crouched carefully. Pain pushed through his right knee, and he caught the door handle for balance. "Easy," he muttered, though he was not sure whether he meant himself or whatever was under the vehicle. He pulled a flashlight from his jacket pocket and switched it on. The beam cut beneath the cruiser. Snow had blown halfway under the chassis. For a moment he saw only ice, shadow, and the dark line of the axle. Then two amber eyes reflected the light. Callum went still. A dog was pressed behind the rear wheel. German Shepherd, young. Much younger than any working K9 Callum had known. Black and tan fur clung wetly to a lean body, and small ridges of ice had formed along the outer coat. The dog trembled hard enough that its shoulder visibly shook against the frozen ground. A dark blue nylon collar circled the neck. One side hung loose, broken, no tag. Callum lowered the flashlight so the beam was no longer directly in the dog's eyes. "Well," he said softly, "you picked a bad parking spot." The dog did not growl. That worried Callum more than growling would have. A frightened dog with strength left could bark, retreat, bare teeth. This one simply watched him. Callum removed his right glove. Cold immediately bit into his fingers. He placed his bare hand on the snow beneath the cruiser, palm down, several inches beyond the dog's reach. "Not gonna grab you." The dog's ears shifted. The left ear stood higher than the right. Callum noticed a small, irregular notch along the outer edge of the right ear. "Your call." The shepherd stared at the offered hand. Callum waited. Wind-driven snow gathered across the shoulder of his jacket. His knee began to burn. Still he waited. Eventually the dog stretched its neck forward. Its black nose touched Callum's fingers. Cold. Far too cold. Callum kept his hand still. "That's it." The shepherd moved again. One front paw slid across the ice, then another. The movement looked painfully slow, as though the dog had to negotiate with its own body for every inch. Callum's chest tightened. "Come on." The dog reached his wrist and stopped. Callum moved his hand carefully beneath the chest. No resistance. He slid his other arm under the hindquarters and pulled the dog free. The shepherd felt lighter than expected, and freezing. Callum opened his jacket and pressed the dog against his thermal shirt before closing the coat as far as he could around both of them. The dog's head remained outside. Its body continued shaking against Callum's ribs. "All right," Callum whispered. "House." Standing was harder. His injured knee nearly failed when he pushed upward. He caught the cruiser, waited for the joint to settle, then straightened. The dog made no attempt to escape. Callum crossed the yard slowly, one step at a time. The porch light seemed much farther away now. By the time he reached the steps, his breathing was heavy. He gripped the railing. The shepherd's heartbeat fluttered rapidly against his chest. That changed something. Callum had spent 14 months trying not to need anyone. This animal did not care about that arrangement. For the next few minutes, something depended entirely on him. Callum climbed the steps. Inside, he kicked the door shut and went straight to the living room. He lowered the dog onto a thick rug near the cold fireplace, then grabbed split wood from the rack. His movements became efficient. Kindling, match. Damper. Logs. Flame. A rhythm he understood. He brought 2 towels from the bathroom and carefully dried the dog without rubbing too hard. The shepherd barely lifted its head. Callum reached for his phone. Dr. Evelyn Pike answered on the 4th ring. Pike. "Evelyn, it's Callum." There was a short pause. "Something wrong with your knee?" "No." That sounded convincing. "I found a dog." Another pause. "In this weather?" "Under my cruiser." Callum described the shaking, the wet coat, the weak response. Evelyn's voice changed immediately from familiar sarcasm to clinical focus. "Warm him slowly. No heating pad directly against him. Towels, blankets, room heat. Small amounts of lukewarm water if he'll take it. Don't feed him a full meal yet." Callum looked down. The dog's amber eyes had opened again. "What am I watching for?" Breathing getting weaker. Loss of responsiveness. Pale gums. "If anything changes badly, call me again. Roads are still a mess, but I'll figure something out." Callum nodded, despite knowing Evelyn could not see him. "Okay." "Callum." "Yeah?" "Keep him away from direct heat until his temperature comes up gradually." "I heard you." "I know you did. I also know you're a cop." That almost earned a smile. Almost. Callum wrapped the shepherd in a dry blanket and sat on the floor beside the rug. "Just until the roads open," he said. Evelyn laughed quietly through the phone. "That usually means you're already keeping an eye on him." Callum looked at the dog. "Good night, Evelyn." He ended the call. Nearly 2 hours passed. The fire filled the room with steady warmth. Callum gave the dog a few small amounts of water. Gradually, the violent trembling weakened into occasional shivers. Color returned to the gums. The shepherd raised its head. Then, for the first time, it studied Callum with something other than exhaustion. Callum was sitting in the armchair now, his right leg stretched forward. "You're looking better." The dog blinked. Callum stood to refill his own water glass. Behind him came the quiet scrape of paws. He turned. The shepherd had pushed itself upright. Its legs were uncertain, but it was attempting to follow. "No." Callum raised his right hand automatically, palm outward. A simple stop signal. He had used it dozens of times around Department K9 teams when handlers needed people to freeze their movement. The reaction was immediate. The young shepherd stopped. Not dramatically, not with the rigid precision of a seasoned police dog. Its rear legs wobbled, and after a second it lowered into an uneven sit. But it stopped. Callum's hand remained raised. The dog looked directly at him, waiting. Callum slowly lowered his arm. The shepherd did not move. The room suddenly felt different. Callum forgot the glass of water, forgot the radio in the kitchen, forgot for several seconds the ache that had lived inside his right knee for more than a year. He stared at the young German shepherd sitting beside the fire. Someone had taught this dog to listen, and somehow in the middle of the worst storm North Ember had seen all winter, the dog had ended up beneath Callum Rourke's cruiser. The storm did not ease after midnight. It changed. The wind lost some of its rage, but the snow kept falling in dense, steady sheets that erased the yard beyond Callum's windows. By 1 in the morning, the porch steps had disappeared beneath a smooth white rise, and the police cruiser outside looked as though someone had slowly buried it from the tires upward. Inside, the fire had settled into a steady orange glow. Callum sat in the armchair with his right leg stretched toward the hearth. The young German shepherd lay several feet away on an old folded blanket. Callum had followed Evelyn Pike's instructions carefully. Small amounts of water, a little food, nothing heavy, no direct heat. The dog had eaten without urgency, then curled on the blanket as if conserving every remaining ounce of energy. Callum watched for a while. He did not know why. The dog was breathing normally now. That should have been enough. Still, every few minutes, Callum looked over to make sure the chest was rising. "You're fine," he said eventually. The shepherd opened one amber eye. Callum leaned back. That wasn't an invitation. The eye closed again. There was still no name. Callum preferred it that way. A name turned an accident into an arrangement. Tomorrow, if the county road crews made enough progress, he would take the dog to Evelyn's clinic. She would check for a chip, make a few calls, and figure out who had lost him. Then Callum would come home. Alone. The plan was simple. Simple plans had become important to him. At 2:13, Callum checked the doors. At 2:16, he adjusted the damper on the fireplace. At 2:23, he turned the police radio down until dispatch voices were barely audible from the kitchen. Then he walked to the bedroom. The shepherd lifted his head. Callum noticed, but kept moving. "Stay!" No hand signal this time, just the word. The dog remained on the blanket. Callum stopped at the hallway entrance and looked back. Good. He was not sure why he had said it. The bedroom was cold enough that Callum could see faint frost at the lower corners of the window. He removed his dark thermal shirt, rubbed a hand across his aching knee, and climbed beneath the quilt. Outside, branches scraped softly against the roof. Callum closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly, then all at once. The road in the dream was black, not dark, black. The kind of slick frozen pavement that swallowed light until red and blue emergency strobes stretched across it like broken ribbons. Daniel sat in the passenger seat. Callum could see him clearly this time. 44 then, brown hair cut short, broad hands braced against the dash. "Easy," Daniel said. The cruiser fishtailed. Callum corrected. Too much? Or maybe too late. The pickup appeared from the right, already sliding sideways. Headlights, chrome grille, a wall of white snow exploding from its tires. Callum pushed the brake. The steering wheel went light in his hands. Daniel shouted his name. Then came the sound. Not one impact, several, metal folding, glass cracking somewhere out of sight, the seatbelt locking across Callum's chest, the sudden white bloom of the airbag. Then nothing except the smell of powder and the strange silence after motion stops. Callum woke sitting upright. His right hand clutched the quilt. His left was pressed hard against his ribs. The room was dark. For one disorienting second, he waited for flashing emergency lights to sweep across the walls. None came, only the dim blue-gray light of snow outside. Callum took a breath. Too fast. Another? His chest refused to settle. "Bedroom?" he whispered. The grounding words that had worked outside the cruiser did not come as easily now. He heard something in the hallway. A soft click, then another, toenails against wood. Callum looked toward the half-open door. The shepherd stood there, a dark silhouette with two faint amber eyes. Callum closed his eyes. "Go back." The dog did not move. "Go." Callum's voice was sharper this time, still nothing. Then the dog approached. Slowly. There was no bounce in the movement, no nervous rush of a puppy expecting attention. He came to the side of the bed and stopped. Callum's hand was hanging over the edge of the mattress. The shepherd touched his nose to Callum's knuckles. Callum pulled his fingers back slightly. The dog waited, then touched them again. That was different, not obedience. Not exactly. Callum stared at him. "What?" The shepherd placed both front paws on the edge of the mattress. His hind legs stayed on the floor. Callum almost told him down. Instead, he reached without thinking and rested one hand against the dog's neck. The shepherd moved forward. Only after Callum's hand remained there did the dog climb partly onto the mattress. He did not sprawl across Callum. He settled his upper body heavily over Callum's thighs, his shoulder resting close to the injured right knee. Callum stiffened. The dog stayed still. Warmth spread through the quilt. The shepherd breathed in, out, in, out. Callum found himself listening, not to the wind, not to the crash replaying in his head, to the breathing, slow, steady. Callum's own breaths gradually lengthened. The fist around the quilt loosened, his jaw unclenched. He rested his palm behind the dog's ear. That's enough. The shepherd did not leave. Callum looked toward the dark window. A strange thought arrived without warning. For more than a year, people had tried to help him by asking questions. How was the knee? Was he sleeping? Had he talked to somebody? Did he want company? Every question had required an answer. The dog required nothing. He simply stayed. Callum lowered himself back against the pillow. The shepherd remained partly across his legs. Callum did not order him down. When he woke again, pale morning light had filled the room. The dog was gone. For a moment, Callum wondered if he had imagined the entire thing. Then he heard something move in the kitchen. A cabinet door. Callum sat up. Seriously? He reached for his jeans. By the time he came down the hallway, the shepherd was sitting near the living room rug, looking innocent. Nothing appeared damaged. Callum checked anyway. No countertops, no cabinets, no creative interpretation of house rules. The dog wagged once. Callum stared at him. "You're trouble." A vehicle engine sounded outside. Callum moved to the front window. A dark county SUV crawled through the newly cut path toward the house, tires pushing through churned snow. He recognized the vehicle before it stopped. Officer Tessa Monroe climbed out wearing a Navy winter patrol jacket, charcoal snow pants, and black insulated boots. Her auburn hair had been pulled into a low ponytail beneath a dark knit cap. A stainless travel mug occupied one hand. She knocked twice and opened the door before Callum answered. "You alive?" "You're already inside." "So yes." Tessa kicked snow from her boots and finally noticed the shepherd beside the fireplace. She stopped. Her hazel-green eyes moved from the dog to Callum. "Please tell me you didn't order a dog during a blizzard." "Found him." "Of course you did." Callum headed for the coffee maker. Tessa watched him. Then the dog. Then Callum again. "You sleep?" "Some." That answer usually ended conversations. Tessa did not press. She removed her cap and set the travel mug on the counter. "Secondary roads open as far as Miller Creek. Highways still getting cleared." Callum nodded. "Evelyn?" "Clinic opened an hour ago. Emergency only until noon." "Good." Tessa leaned against the counter. "You've said more words in the last 30 seconds than you did at Briefing Tuesday." Callum poured coffee. "I wasn't at Briefing Tuesday." "That explains it." The shepherd stood when Callum crossed toward the mudroom. Callum pulled his forest green jacket from a hook. One black duty glove slipped from the pocket and dropped to the floor. Neither Callum nor Tessa moved toward it. The dog did. He lowered his head, picked up the glove gently, then walked toward Callum. He stopped directly in front of him and placed it at Callum's boots. Tessa's expression changed. Not surprise exactly. Attention. Callum looked down at the glove. The dog sat. Tessa asked, "He trained?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Callum picked up the glove. The leather was wet with dog saliva. He should have found that annoying. Instead, he slipped it onto his hand. They went outside 15 minutes later. The storm had broken enough to expose a sharp blue sky between moving clouds. Snow covered everything in clean white contours. The world looked larger without the wind. The shepherd stayed near Callum without being asked. Not in a perfect heel, sometimes half a step ahead, sometimes behind. Young enough to sniff at a buried branch, disciplined enough to return when Callum changed direction. Callum followed the edge of the driveway toward the pines. Tessa walked several feet behind, letting him work. Near the tree line, Callum stopped. Tracks. Partly filled by overnight snow, but still readable where thick pine branches had provided cover. He crouched carefully. The prints were canine, the size matched. Tessa looked toward the dog. "That him?" "Looks like it." Callum traced the route with his eyes. The tracks did not come across the exposed field. They ran between tree trunks, crossed a shallow drainage cut, then followed the lee side of a low snowbank. The pattern was not military, not tactical. Callum refused to romanticize it, but it was deliberate. "He avoided the open ground," Tessa said. "Wind's worse there." So he knew that. Or learned fast. Callum followed the trail another 20 yards. The tracks disappeared where drifting snow had filled the gap. He straightened slowly. His knee complained. The shepherd looked up at him immediately. Callum noticed, again. Tessa noticed him noticing. "That dog keeps checking your face." "He checks everything." "No, he checks everything. He watches you." Callum said nothing. They turned back toward the house. The shepherd trotted ahead until Callum slowed. Then he slowed too. By the porch, Tessa stopped. "You gonna keep calling him dog?" Callum looked down. The shepherd sat in the snow, ears forward, amber eyes fixed calmly on him. Callum had no reason to name him. The dog probably already had one. Someone somewhere was likely worried. By afternoon, Evelyn might solve the whole thing. Callum knew all of that. Still, a word came to him. Marlow. The shepherd's head turned sharply. Tessa smiled. Callum frowned. "That doesn't mean anything." "Didn't say it did." Marlow stood and stepped closer to Callum's left leg. Callum opened the front door. "Inside, Marlow." The dog crossed the threshold. Callum followed. This time, hearing the name in the quiet house did not feel like an accident. The highway reopened just after 8 the next morning. Not completely. State plows had cleared one narrow lane through North Ember and packed the remaining snow into high white walls along both shoulders. Black ice still shone beneath the morning sun, and every intersection carried a temporary warning sign. Callum drove slower than usual. Marlow sat on the passenger side floor rather than the seat, wrapped loosely in an old gray blanket. The young shepherd looked better than he had the night before, but Callum could still see fatigue in the way Marlow rested his chin between his front paws. "Don't get comfortable," Callum said. Marlow's left ear shifted. Callum looked back at the road. He had already said the same thing twice that morning. The words were beginning to sound less convincing. North Ember Veterinary Clinic occupied a low brick building near the western edge of town, squeezed between a hardware store and an insurance office. Someone had cleared the front walkway before sunrise, leaving 2 clean paths through snow nearly knee-high. Callum parked near the side entrance. When he opened the passenger door, Marlow stood but hesitated before stepping down. Callum noticed immediately. "Easy." He slid one hand beneath the dog's chest and supported some of the weight. Marlow did not resist. Inside, the clinic smelled faintly of disinfectant, coffee, and damp winter coats. Dr. Evelyn Pike appeared from the back hallway wearing teal scrubs beneath a light gray clinic coat. Her silver-brown bob curved neatly along her jaw, and tortoiseshell glasses rested low on her nose. A black stethoscope hung around her neck. She looked first at Callum, then at Marlow. "You brought him in yourself." Callum closed the door behind him. "That was the arrangement." Evelyn raised one eyebrow. "The arrangement was for you to keep him alive until morning." "He's alive." "So I see." Marlow approached Evelyn carefully. She crouched without reaching for him. "Hello, handsome." Marlow sniffed her fingers, then looked back toward Callum. Evelyn noticed. She noticed most things. Exam room 2. Callum followed her down the hall. Marlow walked beside him, but the perfect-looking discipline from the house was gone. The dog paused twice to smell the baseboards and became briefly fascinated by a cardboard display of dental chews outside the room. Callum found that strangely reassuring. At least one mystery had an ordinary explanation. He was still young. Inside the exam room, Evelyn patted the padded table. Up. Callum started to lift Marlow. Evelyn stopped him. Knee. I can manage. I know you can. That's not the same as needing to. She lowered the table instead. Callum gave her a look. Evelyn ignored it. Marlow stepped onto the surface with some encouragement and sat awkwardly near the edge. Evelyn began the examination. She checked his gums, eyes, temperature, and breathing. She ran experienced fingers along his ribs and shoulders, then carefully lifted each paw. Marlow tolerated most of it well. When Evelyn touched a tender pad on the rear paw, he pulled back sharply and looked offended. There he is, Evelyn said. What? The 10-month-old dog. Callum folded his arms. You sure about the age? Roughly, 9 to 11 months. Teeth are the best clue. Body development fits too. She examined the paw again more gently. Mild cold irritation. Nothing severe. He's also a little dehydrated. He drank. Not enough to replace what he lost. Marlow turned his head toward Callum as if the discussion concerned someone else entirely. Evelyn continued. He needs rest. Short bathroom walks. No running around in deep snow. Small meals today. Normal portions tomorrow if his stomach behaves. Callum nodded. Evelyn glanced over. You taking notes? I remember things. You also ignore doctors. I ignore human doctors. That distinction is doing a lot of work. Callum almost smiled. Almost. Evelyn opened a cabinet and removed a black handheld scanner. Let's see if somebody planned ahead. Callum watched as she switched it on. The device gave a short electronic chirp. Evelyn passed it slowly over Marlow's shoulders. Nothing. She moved farther down the back. The scanner beeped. Callum straightened. There. Evelyn repositioned the scanner and read the display. A long identification number appeared. Callum felt some tension leave his shoulders. Good. Evelyn looked at him. That sounded disappointed. It means we know who owns him. It means we know which registry holds the chip. Close enough. Evelyn wrote down the number and moved to the small computer in the corner. Callum rested one hand on the edge of the exam table. Marlow leaned slightly against his wrist. Evelyn typed. For 30 seconds, the only sounds were the computer keys and the quiet heating vent overhead. Then she stopped. That's irritating. Callum looked over. What? The chip is active, but the registration isn't tied to an individual. Company? Organization. She turned the monitor slightly. A basic registry page showed the microchip number, vaccination status, and an owner field listing a holding organization Callum had never heard of. Below it was a contact number. Evelyn dialed from the clinic phone. An automated recording answered. The number was no longer in service. Callum exhaled. So the chip tells us almost nothing. It tells us he didn't come from nowhere. Evelyn printed the registry page. That matters. Callum looked at Marlow. For some reason, the uncertainty bothered him more now than it had the night before. Finding the owner should have simplified everything. Instead, the dog had gone from being lost to belonging somewhere Callum could not immediately identify. Evelyn returned to the table. Let me finish before you start investigating the dog like a burglary. I wasn't. You made the face. What face? The police face. Callum decided not to ask. Evelyn checked Marlow's teeth, then gently lifted the left ear. Clean. She moved to the right ear. Marlow shifted. Callum put one hand against the dog's chest. "Easy." Evelyn angled the examination light. Then she stopped, not dramatically, just enough that Callum noticed. "What?" "Hold on." She adjusted her glasses. Marlow tried to turn his head. Callum scratched beneath his chin, keeping him still. Evelyn leaned closer. "There's ink." Callum frowned. "Tattoo?" "Looks like it." She used a small light to illuminate the inner surface of the ear. Callum stepped closer. Beneath the fine fur and pale skin were several compact dark characters, faded slightly, still legible. SWK27. Callum read them aloud. SWK27. The letters meant nothing to him. Evelyn kept looking. Then her expression changed. Not shock, recognition. "You know it?" Callum asked. "I know the prefix." She lowered Marlow's ear. SW. Callum waited. Second watch. The name landed somewhere in Callum's memory. He had seen it on a flyer at the department. Maybe an email? Something people had forwarded after the crash. He had deleted most of those. "What is it?" Evelyn turned toward the counter. Canine Support Program. First responders mostly. Police, fire, dispatch, EMS. Service dogs? Among other things. Callum looked at Marlow again. The dog had lowered himself onto the table and was now trying to lick the edge of the blanket. Suddenly the dog's strange behavior became less strange. Not solved, but narrowed. Evelyn pulled out her phone. "I know someone with the County K9 unit who's worked around second watch." Callum glanced at her. "You planning to call them?" "Yes." "You could give me the number." "I could." She tapped the screen. "You're on restricted duty, Sergeant. Consider this a civilian favor." Callum leaned against the counter. "I hate when people say that." "I know." The call took less than 3 minutes. Evelyn spoke briefly with a county handler named Price, read the tattoo code, and asked only whether the prefix matched. When she ended the call, she wrote a phone number on the back of the printed registry page. "New public contact number. Apparently, Second Watch changed providers a few months ago. Registry didn't get updated." Callum took the paper. "Reasonable?" Evelyn blinked at him. "That may be the first time I've heard you say that about administrative failure." Callum ignored the comment. He looked at the number, then at Marlow. For the first time since finding the dog, Callum hesitated before taking the next obvious step. If he called, the uncertainty would end. Somebody would identify the dog. Somebody would come for him. The problem would be solved. That was what Callum wanted, wasn't it? Marlow slid one paw toward the edge of the table. Callum placed a hand against his chest before he could jump. "Stay." Marlow stayed. Callum picked up his phone. He dialed. A woman answered on the third ring. "Second Watch Canine Center, Miriam speaking." Her voice was warm but efficient. Callum looked at the code again. "My name is Sergeant Callum Rourke, North Ember Police Department." There was a tiny pause at the title. "How can I help you, Sergeant?" "I've got a German Shepherd here. Male. Around 10 months. Microchip registry led nowhere, but there's an earmark." "All right." Callum read it. SWK27. Silence. Not disconnected silence. Human silence. Callum straightened. "Ma'am?" Miriam inhaled. "Where are you?" "North Ember." "Is he alive?" The question changed Callum's posture instantly. "Yes." Another breath came through the phone. Longer this time. "Is he hurt?" "Cold exposure, mild dehydration, paw irritation. Vet says he'll be fine." Miriam said nothing for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its professional smoothness. "Thank God." Callum looked toward Evelyn. She had heard enough to understand. Marlow rested his chin on Callum's wrist. Miriam continued. "K27 went missing during the storm 2 nights ago." Callum's eyes narrowed. "From your facility?" "No, transport vehicle." she explained carefully. A second watch van had been moving several adolescent dogs between training locations before the worst of the weather arrived. Outside North Ember, conditions deteriorated faster than expected. The van slid into a drainage ditch. No serious injuries. But one crate door had warped enough for the latch to loosen. By the time the driver and assistant got the vehicle stabilized, they realized one dog was gone, Miriam said. How far from town? She gave him the mile marker. Callum knew it immediately, less than 2 miles from his house. He looked through the clinic window toward the snow-covered street. The tracks, the tree line. The route suddenly made sense. They searched? As long as they safely could. Sheriff's office checked the area too. Visibility was almost zero. Callum nodded to himself. No miracle. No impossible journey. A scared young dog had escaped from a damaged crate, found cover, followed the trees, and reached the first sheltered place it could. His cruiser. Miriam asked, "Is he with you now?" Callum looked down. Marlow's eyes had begun to close. "Yeah? You've been caring for him?" "Since I found him." Miriam's voice softened. "Then I owe you more than a thank you." "You don't owe me anything." Callum immediately heard how automatic the answer sounded. Miriam did not argue. Instead, she asked for Evelyn's clinic information so Second Watch could coordinate medical records and transport. Callum provided it. The practical details should have ended the call. They nearly did. Then Miriam said, "Lieutenant Hollowell will want to speak with you." Callum's hand tightened around the phone. The clinic seemed suddenly too quiet. "What, Lieutenant?" "Grant Hollowell." Callum did not answer. Miriam waited. Callum turned away from Evelyn and looked through the glass door into the empty waiting room. A memory arrived that had nothing to do with crashing metal. Police academy? A training yard in summer? Grant Hollowell standing in front of a line of rookies, steel-gray eyes, missing nothing. Callum had been 24. Too confident. Too quick to answer. Grant had spent 16 weeks teaching him that being first into every problem did not make a man useful. Callum looked down at the scratched face of his black watch. "Grant Hollowell," he repeated. "You know him?" "Yeah." Marlow shifted closer to Callum's leg. Callum could already hear another sound in his memory. Not an accident. A phone vibrating on his kitchen table 14 months ago. Hollowell? Then again 2 days later. And again the following week. 6 calls, 6 voicemails. Callum had listened to the first one. He had never answered any of them. Miriam said something on the line, but Callum needed a second before he understood the words. "Sergeant Rourke? I'm here. Would you like me to have him call you?" Callum stared at Marlow. The dog had fallen asleep beneath his hand. "No?" Miriam hesitated. Callum added, "Give me a little time." "All right." He ended the call. Evelyn did not ask what Grant Hollowell meant to him. That was one of the reasons Callum trusted her. She simply looked at Marlow and said, "Well, at least we know where he came from." Callum nodded. They did. That should have made everything easier. Instead, Callum stood in the quiet examination room with an old name back in his life and a young German shepherd sleeping against his leg. He had found Marlow's past, and without meaning to, Marlow had just found a door Callum had kept closed for 14 months. Second Watch called before 9 the next morning. Callum was standing at the kitchen counter, spreading peanut butter across a piece of toast, when his phone vibrated beside the coffee pot. Marlow was lying near the refrigerator with his chin on his paws, watching the knife move back and forth with suspicious concentration. Callum glanced at the screen. Second Watch. Canine Center. Marlow's ears lifted. "That's probably about you." Callum answered. Miriam Sloane sounded more rested than she had the day before. "We can send someone for K-27 this afternoon if the West Highway stays open." Callum looked out the kitchen window. The sky was bright, but plows were still working the road beyond the property. "When?" There was a pause while Miriam checked something. "Actually, hold on." Callum heard muffled conversation. Then she returned. "Never mind. State Patrol just closed the canyon section again. Drifting over the ridge." Callum said nothing. "We'll reassess tomorrow," Miriam continued. "If it doesn't improve, probably the following morning." "Fine." "You sure?" Callum looked down. Marlow had abandoned the refrigerator and moved beside his right boot. "Why wouldn't I be?" Miriam gave a small laugh. "No reason." Callum hung up. 2 more days. He should have found that inconvenient. Instead, he found himself calculating how much dog food remained. That bothered him more. By mid-morning, the house had acquired a routine without anyone officially creating one. Callum made coffee. Marlow lay beside his right foot. Callum moved to the living room. Marlow followed 1 step behind. Callum stood at the window to watch a county truck crawl past. Marlow sat nearby without leaning against him or demanding attention. He simply adjusted himself to wherever Callum was. It was different from neediness. Callum had known needy dogs. Marlow seemed less interested in constant affection than in maintaining awareness. The young shepherd kept track of him. That was all. At 10, Callum decided to test the obedience. Not because he was curious. He told himself it was useful information for second watch. Marlow sat in the center of the living room. Callum stood several feet away. "Sit." Marlow sat. "Down." Marlow lowered himself immediately. "Stay." Callum walked toward the kitchen. Marlow stayed. Callum took 6 more steps. Still good. Then the toaster clicked. Marlow's head snapped toward it. His nose lifted. Callum waited. Marlow remained down for approximately 3 seconds. Then he got up and walked directly toward the smell of toast. Callum stared at him. "So much for elite discipline." Marlow sniffed the counter. "Back." Marlow looked at him. Callum pointed toward the living room. Marlow returned. Not quickly, but he returned. Callum tried again. "Stay." This time Marlow made it nearly 30 seconds before a clump of snow slid from the roof outside. He stood, one ear tilted toward the sound. Callum folded his arms. "You're terrible at this." Marlow wagged. Callum's mouth moved before he could stop it. A smile, small, brief, but real. He tried heel next. Marlow understood the position. He moved to Callum's left side and matched him through the kitchen and living room. Then Callum passed the trash can. Marlow broke position to investigate. Callum sighed. "You're 10 months old. That explains a lot." The dog looked at him as if accepting the diagnosis. Something about the imperfection made Callum more comfortable. A perfectly trained dog would have felt like equipment. Marlow was not equipment. Marlow was young, intelligent, curious, and occasionally distracted by bacon grease. That made him easier to trust. Around noon, the police radio in the kitchen crackled louder than usual. Callum had left it on. A patrol unit was responding to a 2-car collision near the North Junction. Nothing major. No one trapped. But the dispatcher used a phrase Callum knew too well. "Road surface is glazed." His hand stopped halfway to the coffee mug. The room seemed to narrow, not dramatically, just enough. His shoulders tightened, his fingers curled. Marlow stood. Callum did not notice. The dog crossed the kitchen. A cold nose touched the back of Callum's hand. Callum looked down. Marlow touched him again. Not now. Marlow remained close. The dispatcher continued speaking. Callum reached for the radio and turned the volume down. Marlow sat. Callum breathed once, then again. The moment passed. He looked at the dog. "You don't even know what that means." Marlow stared back. Callum realized the sentence was wrong before he finished it. The dog did not need to know what the words meant. Maybe he only needed to recognize what they did to Callum. A knock sounded at the front door 20 minutes later. Tessa Monroe entered carrying 2 grocery bags and a cardboard tray of coffee. "You're welcome." Callum looked at the bags. "I didn't ask for groceries." "No, you've developed a very effective system for never asking for anything." She set the bags on the counter. Marlow appeared immediately. Tessa pointed at him. "No." Marlow stopped. "See," she said, "we have boundaries." Callum looked into one bag. Eggs, bread, soup, coffee, a package of ground beef. "You bought dog food?" Tessa removed her gloves. "I bought food. One bag happens to have a dog on it." "You're encouraging this." "This?" Callum glanced at Marlow. Tessa looked at him, too. "Whatever this is." Before Callum could answer, a heavy scraping noise rolled past the front of the house. A municipal snowplow. Its metal blade caught a patch of compacted ice. The sound was harsh, steel grinding against frozen pavement. Callum's body reacted instantly. His jaw locked, his right hand tightened around the edge of the counter. Tessa saw it. Marlow moved first. The shepherd walked to Callum, turned sideways, and pressed his shoulder against Callum's right shin. Then he lowered himself against Callum's boot. Tessa did not ask what was wrong. She did not say his name. She simply watched the dog settle. The snowplow passed. Silence returned. Callum released the counter. Tessa said quietly, "He notices before you do." Callum looked toward the window. "Apparently, everyone does." Tessa did not smile. That was what made the sentence stay with him. For most of the afternoon, she helped clear the remaining snow near the porch and checked the backup generator while Callum handled smaller tasks inside. Before leaving, Tessa stood near the door, pulling on her gloves. "You coming back to briefing next week?" Callum hesitated. Restricted duty technically required him to attend. He had been skipping whenever possible. "Maybe." Tessa nodded as if he had said something more definite. "Progress?" "Tessa." She opened the door. "Callum." Then she left. The house seemed quieter afterward, not empty, just quieter. Marlow slept near the fireplace. Callum sat at the kitchen table with his phone in front of him. For nearly 15 minutes he did nothing. Then he opened voicemail. There were old messages he had never deleted. Some were administrative, some from Daniel. He skipped those. Then he found the first one from Grant Hollowell, 14 months old. Callum stared at the date. His thumb hovered above the screen. He almost backed out. Instead, he pressed play. Grant's voice came through the speaker, older than Callum remembered, still steady. "Callum, you don't owe me a conversation. Just answer once so I know you're still there." Nothing else. No lecture, no advice, no demand that Callum explain himself. The message ended after 11 seconds. Callum sat very still. He had remembered it differently. In his mind, Grant had called because people were worried, because Callum had become a problem that required checking. But that was not what the message said. "Just answer once, so I know you're still there." Callum pressed stop even though it had already ended. Marlow lifted his head from the rug. Callum turned the phone face down. That was 14 months ago. Marlow stood and crossed the room. He placed his muzzle on Callum's right knee. No nose tap. No pressure across the leg. Just his chin. Callum rested one hand behind the dog's ears. This time, he did not tell Marlow to move. The next morning, an email arrived from Miriam. The subject line read, SWK27, Foundation Training Summary. Callum opened it at the kitchen table. Marlow lay beneath the window, watching snow fall in slow clumps from the pine branches. The file was only a few pages. Callum expected medical records and vaccination dates. Instead, he found behavioral assessments. Name, K27 age, approximately 10 months. Program track, psychiatric service support for first responders. Placement status, unassigned training phase, adolescent foundation. Callum read more slowly. Marlow had not been trained for patrol work, no apprehension work, no narcotics, no explosive detection, no specialized search operations. The focus was people, recognizing changes in breathing, interrupting repetitive or escalating behavior with nose contact, beginning partial pressure grounding, retrieving familiar objects carrying a handler's scent, maintaining obedience in loud, crowded, or unpredictable settings. Callum stopped. Retrieving familiar objects. He looked toward the mudroom. The black duty glove was still sitting on the shelf where he had placed it after Marlow brought it to him. Callum looked back at the file. Another paragraph described Marlow's strengths. High handler orientation, strong response to human body tension, confident in unfamiliar environments. Then came the weaknesses. Food distraction, immature impulse control, occasional loss of focus around moving vehicles. Callum smiled faintly. So the toaster incident made your permanent record. Marlow's tail moved against the floor. Callum continued reading. There was nothing mystical in the report. No suggestion that Marlow could sense souls, destinies, or hidden suffering. The dog had been taught patterns. Breathing changed. Hands tightened. Movement became repetitive. Marlow had been conditioned to notice. Callum thought back to the night in the bedroom. The nose against his knuckles. The pause. The second touch. The weight settling across his legs only after Callum reached down. It had not been magic. That should have made it smaller. Instead, it made the memory more meaningful. Somebody had spent months teaching this young dog how to recognize when a person might be slipping away from the present. Marlow had learned the lesson, but training alone had not forced Callum to respond. Callum could have pushed him away. He could have closed the door. He could have ordered him back to the blanket and spent the rest of the night alone. He had not. That realization landed differently than anything else had. Callum had spent more than a year believing isolation had simply happened to him. The injury, the crash, the calls. People stopped visiting. Daniel disappeared from his daily life. Work became distant, but sitting at the kitchen table with Marlow's file open in front of him, Callum recognized an uncomfortable piece of the truth. Some doors had closed. Others he had closed himself. Marlow walked over and sat beside his chair. Callum lowered one hand. The shepherd pressed his forehead beneath it. Callum scratched gently between the ears. "You're trained," he said. Marlow leaned harder into the hand. Callum looked again at the heading on the report. Placement status, unassigned. For reasons he did not want to examine yet, he read that line twice. Then he closed the file. Outside, another plow moved along the county road. Callum heard the blade against the pavement. He felt the first tightening in his shoulders. Before Marlow could move, Callum placed his hand on the dog's neck. "I know." Marlow stayed beside him, and for the first time, Callum understood that what had happened between them was not remarkable because the dog knew what to do. It mattered because Callum had finally allowed something to work. 2 days later, the highway finally opened all the way through the canyon. The call from Second Watch came just after sunrise. Miriam Sloan offered to send a vehicle for Marlow. Callum stood beside the kitchen window while she spoke, watching morning light turn the snowfields pale gold. "We can have someone there by noon," Miriam said. Callum looked down. Marlow was stretched across the floor near the back door, chewing carefully on the corner of an old rubber toy Tessa had brought the day before. "No need," Miriam paused. "You sure?" "I can bring him." Another pause. "That's 2.5 hours each way." "I know where the mountains are." Miriam laughed quietly. "All right, I'll let Grant know." Callum nearly told her not to. Instead, he ended the call. An hour later, Tessa stood beside the cruiser while Callum loaded a blanket, water bowl, and the small bag of food Evelyn had recommended. She watched him arrange everything twice. "You know," she said, "they did offer to come get him." "I heard. And yet here you are packing like you're taking him across Canada." Callum shut the rear door. "It's my responsibility." "Sure it is." Callum looked at her. Tessa raised both hands. "I didn't say anything." "You just did." Marlow appeared at the porch steps. Callum pointed toward the passenger side. "Come on." The young shepherd climbed into the cruiser. Tessa leaned against the hood. "You could just admit you want a little more time." Callum closed the door. "I could also start ignoring you professionally instead of personally." "There he is." Callum shook his head and walked around to the driver's side. Tessa called after him. "Drive safe." He lifted one hand without turning. The roads were better than expected. Snow plows had pushed the drifts into massive white banks, leaving asphalt mostly clear beneath a hard blue winter sky. The valleys opened wide between dark pine ridges, and distant mountain slopes shone beneath fresh snow. Marlow sat on the passenger seat with a simple restraint clipped to the collar. For the first 20 miles, the dog watched the landscape. Then he slept. Callum drove slower than necessary. He noticed that, around the first hour, the road was dry, visibility was excellent, traffic was light. There was no practical reason to hold the cruiser 5 miles below the limit. Still, he did. Every mile marker shortened the remaining time. Callum did not like that thought, so he stopped thinking it. At a scenic pullout overlooking a frozen reservoir, he parked long enough to let Marlow drink and stretch. The dog stepped into the snow, sniffed a wooden post, then looked immediately toward Callum. "You know you're going home, right?" Marlow wagged once. Callum crouched and adjusted the dark navy collar Evelyn had fitted after the broken one was removed. "You've got people waiting for you." Marlow leaned forward and pressed his forehead briefly against Callum's shoulder. Callum stood too quickly. His knee protested. "Don't make this complicated." Marlow had no opinion on the matter. They continued west. Second Watch Canine Center sat near the lower foothills of the Bighorn Mountains, reached by a long plowed drive marked by a simple wooden sign. There were no flags, no tactical slogans, no rows of patrol cars. That surprised Callum. He had pictured something closer to an academy. Instead, the property looked halfway between a training center and a quiet medical campus. Several fenced fields stretched across the snow. One held low agility platforms and balance obstacles. Another contained mock sidewalks, benches, doors, and traffic signals. Beyond the main building, Callum saw what looked like the front half of a city bus, mounted permanently beside a covered training area. A trainer in a dark winter vest walked a Labrador through a simulated store entrance. Another worked with a shepherd near an automatic sliding door. Callum parked. Marlow sat upright before the engine stopped. His ears came forward. Recognition. Not excitement exactly. Recognition. Callum unclipped the restraint. "Looks familiar?" Marlow looked toward the main building. Callum opened the door. The dog jumped down. A woman crossing the training yard noticed him. K-27. Marlow's tail moved rapidly. He stepped toward her, then stopped and glanced back at Callum. The woman smiled. "Yeah, that's him." She was younger than Callum expected, perhaps in her 30s, bundled in a gray training jacket. She crouched and greeted Marlow warmly. The dog accepted the attention, but did not lose control. No wild jumping. No frantic barking. Callum found himself relieved by that. Marlow belonged here. That was good. It was supposed to be good. The main door opened. Grant Hollowell stepped outside. Callum had spent the entire drive trying not to imagine this moment. Memory had preserved Grant at 50. Broad-shouldered, sharp-moving, dark hair beginning to gray. Voice that could stop a rookie halfway across a parking lot. The man walking down the steps was almost 60 now. Steel gray hair had thinned slightly at the front. His face carried deeper lines around the eyes and mouth. The shoulders were still broad, but his pace was slower and more deliberate. He wore a charcoal quarter zip fleece, dark utility pants, and brown winter boots. No uniform, no badge. Grant stopped 6 feet away. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Grant looked Callum over from head to boots. "You look terrible," Callum exhaled through his nose. "Good to see you too, Lieutenant." Grant's mouth lifted. "Retired?" "Doesn't seem to have taken." Some habits survive paperwork. His attention dropped to Marlow. The expression changed instantly. Grant crouched. "Well, there you are." Marlow approached. Grant checked the ears, shoulders, paws, and collar with quick familiarity. "You gave everybody a scare, K-27? Marlow licked Grant's wrist. Grant stood and looked at Callum. "Miriam said you found him under your cruiser." "Technically behind the rear wheel." Still correcting details? Still getting them wrong? Grant laughed once. That helped. Not much. Enough. Inside, Grant led Callum through a hallway overlooking one of the training rooms. Callum slowed at the window. A woman sat in a mock living room while a black Labrador practiced moving beneath a table and settling between her feet. Across the room, a trainer deliberately dropped a metal tray. The Labrador startled, recovered, returned attention to the handler. Grant noticed Callum watching. "We build boring dogs." Callum looked at him. "That's your sales pitch? Best service dog in the world is boring 90% of the time." They entered Grant's office. It was smaller than Callum expected. One desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, several framed photographs from police departments across Wyoming. No Academy trophies. No wall of medals. Marlow lay beside Callum's right boot without being told. Grant noticed that too. He sat. "Start from the beginning." Callum did. He described the sound under the cruiser, the cold exposure, Evelyn's instructions, the first hand signal, the broken collar, the tracks along the pines. Grant interrupted only for practical details. "How long before he took water?" "Maybe 40 minutes. "Food?" "Later." "Any vomiting?" "No." "Limping?" "Minor sensitivity in one rear paw. Evelyn cleared it." Grant nodded. Then Callum reached the part about the bedroom. He almost skipped it. Grant waited. Callum stared at the edge of the desk. "I woke up from a bad one." Grant said nothing. Marlow came into the room. Still nothing. He used a nose touch, then partial pressure. Grant leaned back slightly. "Without a cue?" "Yeah." "Did you push him away?" Callum looked up. "No." Grant nodded once. That was all. No surprise, no declaration that something extraordinary had happened. Callum found himself irritated. "You don't seem impressed." "I am. You've got a strange way of showing it." Grant folded his hands. "Marlow's good. We knew that." Callum glanced toward the dog. "He's 10 months old." "And unfinished," Grant continued. "K-27 has strong environmental confidence, strong human orientation, and better body-reading instincts than most dogs his age. That doesn't make him ready. So what does? Time, proofing, public access work, maturity, repetition." Callum thought about the toaster. "Food distraction?" Grant smiled. "Legendary." That drew a short laugh from Callum. Grant's expression softened. Marlow did what he was trained to do. Callum waited. Grant pointed toward him. "You did the part nobody trained him for." "What part?" "You let him stay." Callum's amusement disappeared. Grant continued before Callum could deflect. "A dog can offer a task. Doesn't mean the person accepts it." "I was half asleep." "No." Grant's voice stayed calm. "You knew exactly what you were doing." Callum looked toward the window. Outside, a trainer walked a golden retriever past the mock bus. Grant did not fill the silence. That irritated Callum too. "You always did this." "Did what?" "Wait people out." Works better than yelling? You yelled plenty. I was younger. Callum looked back. So was I. Grant studied him for a moment. Yeah. The word carried more history than Callum wanted. Grant rose and walked to a cabinet. He pulled out Marlow's training folder. Come on. I'll show you where he was headed before he decided to vacation under a police car. They toured the facility. The kennels were warm and quiet, each dog housed separately with clear visual barriers and access to covered exercise runs. The training wing contained ordinary environments recreated with obsessive detail. A grocery checkout lane, a waiting room, a narrow restaurant aisle, a section of bus seating, an apartment bedroom. Callum stopped near the bedroom setup. Marlow entered first, sniffed the rug, then looked back. Grant said, "He's trained in spaces like this because real life doesn't happen on a training field." Callum watched Marlow settle near the mock bed. For the first time, he understood the amount of work behind the simple behaviors he had seen. People had taught Marlow to notice, then taught him what to do with what he noticed. That knowledge did not diminish the dog. It made Callum respect him more. Back in the hallway, Grant asked, "Why didn't you answer?" Callum knew immediately what he meant. He kept walking. "Busy. For 14 months? Apparently." Grant stopped. Callum continued 2 more steps before turning. Grant did not look angry. That would have been easier. "I called 6 times, Grant said. "I know." "So you got them?" "Yes." "You listen?" "1." Grant nodded. "Fair enough." Callum frowned. "That's it? What do you want me to do, Callum? Arrest you for ignoring voicemail?" Callum almost smiled. Grant did not. "I wanted to know you were okay. You didn't want to answer. Both things can be true." Callum looked away. "I wasn't interested in talking." "I figured that out around call 4. Grant resumed walking. He did not ask why. That was worse than being pressured. They reached an intersection in the hallway where Grant's office lay one direction and the main kennel wing the other. Grant stopped. "One thing before you go." Callum waited. Grant looked at him carefully. "Daniel called me too, you know." Everything in Callum seemed to stop, not visibly, only inside. "What?" "After the crash," Callum's voice flattened. "What did he want?" Grant shook his head. "That's between me and Daniel." Callum's jaw tightened. "Then why bring it up?" "Because you've spent 14 months acting like you were the only person who walked away from that night carrying something." Callum stared at him. Grant did not continue. Marlow stood between them, looking from one man to the other. Callum finally said, "I'm here to return the dog." "I know." Grant opened the kennel wing door. "That's all we're doing today." Callum appreciated the boundary and hated what Grant had placed inside it. Daniel had called him, not Callum. Grant. Callum followed Marlow down the hallway. The dog moved toward a trainer he recognized, tail wagging. Then he turned once to check where Callum was. Callum stopped. Marlow stopped too. Grant noticed. Neither man commented. For the first time since leaving North Ember, Callum understood what had been bothering him about the drive. It was not only that Marlow was going back. It was that Callum had brought the dog to the one place where avoiding the past was going to become much harder. The paperwork took less than 10 minutes. Callum hated that. Something that had occupied his house, disrupted his routine, slept beside his bed, and somehow worked its way into the shape of his days could be reduced to 3 signatures and a date. Miriam Sloan sat across from him at a small table near the administration office, reviewing each line before sliding the forms over. She wore a dark teal second-watch polo beneath a navy insulated vest, charcoal utility pants, and waterproof boots still marked with snow from the training yard. Her dark blonde hair was braided over one shoulder, and a black treat pouch rested at her hip. Temporary care transfer ends here, she said, tapping the first page. Medical notes from Dr. Pike are attached. We'll keep him on light activity for another few days. Callum signed. And this confirms you're returning all program equipment. I didn't steal anything. Miriam looked at the dark navy collar around Marlow's neck. That collar is ours. Callum glanced at it. Then I almost stole one thing. Miriam smiled. Callum signed again. Marlow lay beneath the table, his pale tan V-shaped chest marking visible between his front legs. The small notch in his right ear twitched every time someone passed the doorway. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable. That should have helped. Instead, Callum found himself irritated by the fact that Marlow belonged here so naturally. Grant Hollowell stood near the window, pretending to read a training schedule pinned to the wall. Callum knew better. Grant had always been good at giving people enough space to say something without making it obvious he was waiting. Callum put the pen down. That it? Miriam checked the page. That's it. Simple. Official. Finished. Callum pushed the chair back. Marlow stood immediately. Miriam reached for a black working leash hanging from a hook beside the door. The metal clip made a small click as she attached it to Marlow's collar. Callum watched. He had known this moment was coming since the first night. He had said it himself. Just until the roads opened. Then the roads had opened, then closed again. Then there had been the clinic, the code, the phone call, the 2 extra days, the drive. Each delay had given him another excuse not to think about the ending. Now there were no delays left. Callum crouched. His right knee resisted the movement, forcing him to lower himself more carefully than he wanted. Marlow stepped closer. Callum placed one hand against the dog's neck. Good boy, Marlow. The name sounded different here, less like something Callum had given him, more like something they had shared temporarily. Marlow licked the back of Callum's hand once. Callum scratched beneath the left ear. You made a mess of my week. Miriam looked away politely. Callum stood. Marlow remained beside him for one more second. Then Miriam gave the leash a gentle cue. Come on, K-27. Marlow went with her. Callum felt both relief and disappointment at once. Relief because the dog recognized Miriam, because Marlow was not frightened, because he was returning to people who understood what he needed. Disappointment because Callum had expected some part of the dog to hesitate. He disliked himself for that. Miriam led Marlow through the office door into the hall. Grant stayed where he was. Callum turned toward the opposite exit. 3 steps. 4. Behind him, the soft movement of paws stopped. Miriam said, Come on, K-27. Callum did not turn immediately. He told himself not to. This was exactly the kind of meaning people invented after the fact. A dog paused. That was all. Then Miriam spoke again. Let's go. Callum looked back. Marlow stood halfway down the hall. The leash hung loose between him and Miriam. No pulling, no resistance. He simply looked at Callum. His ears were forward. Callum pointed toward Miriam. Go on. Marlow took 2 steps, stopped again. Miriam glanced toward Grant. Grant remained silent. Callum felt something uncomfortable climb into his chest. Not hope. He refused to call it that. Probably confused, Callum said. Miriam looked at the dog. He's not confused. Before Callum could respond, a heavy exterior door at the far end of the building slammed shut. The sound echoed through the hallway, steel against steel. Callum's body reacted before thought arrived. His shoulders locked, his right hand closed into a fist. A flash of sensation moved through him. Not a full memory, not even an image. Just the old physical certainty that something bad had already happened, and his body was arriving late to understand it. He stopped breathing normally. Grant saw it. Miriam saw Marlow. The dog turned instantly. Miriam loosened her grip instead of restraining him. Marlow crossed the hallway quickly, not wildly, directly. He reached Callum, touched his nose against Callum's closed hand, and waited. Callum did not respond. Marlow touched him again. Callum's fingers opened. The dog turned sideways and pressed his shoulder firmly against Callum's injured knee. The weight was familiar now, not enough to hurt. Enough to register. Callum looked down. Marlow stayed. The hallway came back into proportion. The door was only a door. Grant was standing 10 feet away. Miriam was holding the loose end of the leash. Callum released a slow breath. Grant finally spoke. "He's tasking." Callum looked up. "He knows me, that's all." Grant shook his head. "No, he knows what happens to you." Callum's expression hardened. "Don't turn this into something it isn't." "I'm not." Grant walked closer but stopped outside Marlow's space. "If I wanted to sell you a story about fate, I'd charge admission." Miriam almost smiled. Callum did not. Grant continued. He recognized a response pattern. He interrupted it. Then he offered pressure. That's what he's being trained to do. He's done it before. "I know." "So what's different?" Grant looked at Marlow. This time he had a familiar trainer holding the leash. He was in a familiar facility, and he still redirected to you. Callum looked down again. Marlow had not moved. Grant added, "That matters." Callum felt the dangerous pull of wanting the next sentence. He resisted it. "You're saying he should come home with me?" "No." The answer came so quickly that Callum looked up. Grant folded his arms. "I'm saying we pay attention." Callum frowned. Grant continued. "One response does not place a service dog. Neither does attachment. Neither does the fact that you like him." "I never said I liked him." Miriam looked directly at Callum. Grant said, "Sure." Callum ignored both of them. Grant's voice became more practical. "A placement has to work for the dog and the person. Medical need, lifestyle, handler reliability, public access, compatibility over time. Marlow also isn't finished." Callum nodded once. That made sense. Part of him hated that it made sense. "So he stays. Unless you want to explore a trial." Callum stared at Grant. "A what?" Miriam answered. "A supervised trial placement." She loosened the leash further while speaking. "It doesn't make Marlow your dog? It means we evaluate whether continuing his training with you as a potential handler makes sense." Callum looked between them. "What does that involve?" Grant counted on his fingers. "Medical assessment, psychological consultation, handler instruction, training here, work at home, compatibility review." "And if he decides I'm not a fit?" "Marlow doesn't make the decision alone." "That's not what I asked." Grant's eyes narrowed slightly. Callum corrected himself. "If I'm not a fit, then you're not a fit." Callum looked away. The answer should have been ordinary. It did not feel ordinary. "What if I fail?" The hallway went quiet. Grant's expression changed. Not softer, more focused. "Then you fail an assessment." Callum said nothing. "You don't fail at being a person." The words landed harder than Callum expected. He turned toward the nearest window. Outside, sunlight reflected from the training yard so brightly that he had to narrow his eyes. A young Labrador worked beside a trainer near the mock bus. The dog missed a cue. The trainer reset. They tried again. No drama, no judgment. Just another attempt. Callum rubbed his thumb across the scratched face of his wristwatch. Grant waited. Marlow shifted slightly but maintained contact with Callum's leg. Callum said, "I'm still a police officer." "Good. I'm on restricted duty." "I know." "I'm not interested in being treated like a patient every time I walk through a door." "Then don't." Callum looked at him. Grant shrugged. You think everyone who comes here spends all day talking about feelings? I know you. That is not an answer. It's enough of one. Grant almost smiled. Then his expression became serious again. There's a more important question. Callum waited. Grant pointed toward Marlow. Do you actually want him? The answer should have been complicated. Callum had spent days creating complicated explanations: responsibility, temporary care, professional curiosity, making sure the dog got back safely. None of those survived the question. He looked at Marlow. Dark amber eyes, right ear with the small notch, black saddle falling lower on one side. The same animal that had almost frozen beneath his cruiser now stood pressed against his bad knee, as if this position had become the most natural place in the world. Callum exhaled. Yeah? No qualification, no joke, no, for now. Just the truth. Grant nodded. Then we start there. Miriam unclipped the leash. For one brief second, Callum thought she was taking it back. Instead, she held the handle toward him. Callum stared at it. You're serious? Trial means trial. He took the leash. The weight was almost nothing. Still, something changed the instant it settled into his hand. Marlow moved to Callum's left side without being asked. Miriam reached into a cabinet and handed Callum a charcoal black training harness. A small patch read, Service Dog in Training. Use this only according to the program rules, she said. We'll go through everything before you leave. Callum nodded. Grant walked toward the office. Callum thought the conversation was finished. Then Grant stopped. Not quite. Callum's shoulders dropped. What now? Grant opened a desk drawer. He removed a small folded piece of paper. Nothing official, no letterhead. He handed it over. Callum unfolded it. A phone number. He recognized the area code. Then the name beneath it. Daniel Mercer. Callum went still. I have his number. Grant nodded. I know. Then why give me this? Because you haven't used yours. Callum folded the paper once. That's none of your business. No. Grant agreed so easily that Callum had no argument prepared. It isn't. Grant looked toward Marlow. Marlow can help you stay in the room. Then he looked back at Callum. He can't make that call for you? Callum closed his hand around the paper. Marlow sat beside his boot. No nose touch, no pressure, no intervention. The dog simply waited. Callum slipped the paper into his jacket pocket. He did not promise anything. Grant did not ask him to. A few minutes later, Callum walked toward the front doors with Marlow beside him and the second watch leash in his hand. He had arrived expecting to leave alone. Instead, Marlow was coming back with him. But the thing weighing most heavily in Callum's pocket was not the leash, the paperwork, or the training instructions. It was a phone number he had already known for 14 months. The trial placement lasted longer than Callum expected. At first he thought of it in days, then training sessions, then weeks. The calendar mattered less once the routine stopped feeling temporary. Marlow went with him to second watch twice a week at first, then once a week when Miriam decided they were ready to work more independently. The young German shepherd wore the charcoal training harness with the small service dog and training patch, and Callum carried a folded instruction sheet in his jacket pocket even after he had memorized every line. Progress was uneven. That surprised him. Part of Callum had expected training to work like police procedure. Correct input, correct response, repeat until reliable. Marlow did not work that way. Neither did Callum. Some mornings, Marlow noticed the change in Callum's breathing before Callum consciously felt tense. Other times, the dog missed it completely because someone opened a bag of jerky 20 feet away. Some nights, Callum slept until dawn. On others, he woke at 2:30, with the room feeling too small, and the old crash replaying in pieces he did not want. Marlow did not erase those nights. He gave them structure. Nose touch. Wait. Pressure if needed. Release when Callum settled. No drama, no miracle. Just repetition. That was what Grant meant by consistency. Callum learned that consistency belonged to him too. Feed at the same time. Walk at the same time. Practice cues when nothing was wrong, not only when he needed them. Reward the right behavior. Do not confuse dependence with training. The rules irritated him until he realized they worked equally well on people. At second watch, Miriam put them through increasingly ordinary exercises. A grocery aisle, a waiting room, a simulated cafe, a line of people entering and leaving through automatic doors. Callum hated the cafe setup most. Too many eyes, not real judgment, necessarily. But Callum felt every glance toward Marlow's harness. One afternoon, a middle-aged man at the mock counter asked, "What's wrong with you?" The question came from a volunteer following a scripted scenario. Callum knew that. Still, his jaw tightened. Miriam stood 10 feet away. She did not rescue him. Callum answered, "Nothing you need to diagnose." The volunteer nodded and moved on. Later, Miriam said, "You could have ignored him." "I know." "You didn't." "I know." Marlow sat between them, watching a piece of cheese in Miriam's hand. She smiled. "He thinks you both did great." Callum looked down. "He's biased." "He's food-motivated." "That too." The embarrassment faded gradually. Not because Callum stopped noticing the harness. Because he stopped treating every stranger's glance as a verdict. His knee remained less cooperative. Cold mornings still brought stiffness. After long shifts, the ache could climb high enough to shorten his patience. Tessa learned quickly which days to leave him alone. Marlow learned more slowly. On one particularly bad afternoon, Callum snapped, "Move!" when the dog paused in a doorway. Marlow stepped aside immediately, then sat 10 feet away. Callum stood in the kitchen, annoyed at the dog, at himself, at the weather, at the joint that refused to become what it had been. 10 minutes later, he walked over. "Come here." Marlow came. Callum crouched as far as the knee allowed. "Bad day?" Marlow touched his nose to Callum's wrist. Callum exhaled. "I know. Not your problem." The dog leaned against him anyway. That was another lesson Callum had not expected. Repair mattered more than perfection. A week later, Grant watched Callum and Marlow complete a busy public access exercise without a missed cue. He marked something on his clipboard. Callum looked over. "You enjoy that too much." "Paperwork?" "Judging people." Grant kept writing. "Occupational hazard." Marlow settled beneath the bench beside Callum's boots. Grant finally looked up. "You call Daniel?" Callum's attention shifted. "No." Grant nodded. That was it. No lecture, no expression. He went back to the clipboard. Callum waited. "You're not going to say anything?" "You already know what I think." "That's never stopped you before." Grant smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm growing." The conversation ended there. That bothered Callum all the way home. That evening, the house felt restless, not empty anymore. Restless. Callum ate dinner, washed the plate, checked the locks, and turned on the radio. Then turned it off. Marlow followed him from room to room without asking for attention. At 9, Callum put on his jacket. Marlow stood. "Come on." They went outside. The cruiser sat beside the house beneath a thin layer of fresh snow. Callum brushed the windshield, opened the driver's door, and climbed in without starting the engine. Marlow settled on the passenger seat. The cabin was cold. Callum did not turn on the heater. He took his phone from his pocket. Daniel's number was already open. He had looked at it often enough that the digits felt familiar in a way that embarrassed him. 14 months. One button. Callum stared at the screen. Marlow shifted beside him. Callum glanced over. "No?" The dog lowered his head. This one's mine. Callum pressed call. The ringing sounded too loud inside the cruiser. Once, twice, 3 times. Callum nearly ended it. Then the line clicked. Hello? Daniel. The voice was older than Callum remembered, or maybe memory had simply preserved it too well. Callum said nothing. Hello? His thumb hovered near the red button. Marlow remained still. Callum swallowed. Dan, it's Callum. Silence, long enough for Callum to wonder if the call had dropped. Then Daniel said, "Took you long enough?" Callum closed his eyes. The sentence contained humor, but not only humor. Yeah? Another pause. You okay? Daniel asked. Callum almost laughed. That's how we're starting? You called me. Fair? The conversation moved awkwardly at first. Work, weather, North Ember. Daniel had transferred to a county training unit south of Casper after physical rehabilitation. He was still working, though no longer full-time patrol. Callum learned those facts as if hearing about an old acquaintance. That hurt more than he expected. Eventually, Daniel asked, "Why now?" Callum looked toward Marlow. The dog was watching the dark windshield. I should have called before. Yep, Callum tightened his grip on the phone. I didn't know what to say. You could have tried hello? Callum leaned back against the seat. A humorless breath escaped him. I thought you blamed me. Daniel went quiet. Callum continued before courage disappeared. I thought if I called, you'd tell me the crash was my fault. The words felt smaller after being spoken aloud, not less frightening, just smaller. Daniel breathed out slowly. You know what I was angry about? Callum waited. You stopped showing up. Callum stared at the steering wheel. Daniel continued. I didn't need you at the hospital every day. I didn't need an apology every morning. I needed my partner to still be my partner. Callum looked down. His scratched black watch reflected the phone screen. Daniel said, You vanished. I didn't know how to look at you. You could have started by looking. Callum had no defense for that, so he did something unfamiliar. He did not create one. I'm sorry. Daniel was quiet. Then, I know. It was not absolution. Callum was grateful for that. A clean forgiveness would have felt false. They talked another 10 minutes. Nothing dramatic. Daniel was coming through North Ember in 2 weeks for a county training meeting. Coffee, he suggested. Callum said yes. They chose a diner. Tuesday, 8:30. An ordinary appointment. Callum ended the call and remained in the cruiser. Marlow lifted his head. Callum looked at him. I called. Marlow yawned. Callum laughed. Glad somebody's impressed. 2 weeks became 5. Marlow passed his compatibility review, then his public access evaluation, not perfectly. At the final assessment, he became briefly distracted by a rolling cart in the clinic hallway. Miriam reset him. They tried again. Second attempt. Clean. Grant signed the placement recommendation. Callum signed the handler agreement. Marlow was officially placed with him. There was no ceremony, no applause. Miriam handed Callum a finalized folder and said, Don't lose this. Grant added, He means the paperwork. Callum looked at Marlow. I assumed. Before Callum left, Grant stopped him near the entrance. When you're ready, come down once a week. Callum narrowed his eyes. For what? My dog people understand dogs. I could use somebody who understands cops. You trying to hire me? No. Good. Volunteer. That's worse. Grant grinned. Callum did not commit. 3 weeks later, Tessa walked through the North Ember briefing room carrying her stainless travel mug. A volunteer's schedule had been pinned beside the duty roster. She stopped. Wednesday. For me, down 4 p.m. Callum Rourke. Second watch. Schachter First Responder Handler. Support. Tessa looked across the room. Callum was seated at the table reviewing a report. Marlow lay quietly beneath his chair. She said nothing. Callum noticed. "What?" "Nothing." Tessa took her seat. At the end of shift, Callum's phone rang. The screen lit up on the table. Daniel Mercer. Tessa saw the name. Callum picked up immediately. "Hey, Dan." He listened. "Yeah? Thursday works." Tessa pulled on her winter jacket. Callum ended the call. She raised one eyebrow. "What? Nothing?" "That face isn't nothing." Tessa zipped the jacket. "You answered your phone this time." Callum looked at her, then at Marlow. Outside the station windows, light snow drifted beneath the street lamps, turning the parking lot gold and white. His knee still hurt. Some nights were still bad. Certain sounds still reached places in him he wished they did not. He was still a police officer, still 46, still carrying a night he could not rewrite. Nothing had disappeared. But his house was no longer completely silent. His phone was no longer something he watched ring until it stopped. And when Callum began to lose his place in the present, Marlow knew how to help him find it again. Not by carrying him forward, not by living the difficult parts for him, just by staying close enough that Callum no longer had to find the way back alone. Sometimes healing does not begin when the pain disappears. It begins when we stop facing it alone. Callum still carried the memory of the crash, the ache in his knee, and the consequences of the months he spent shutting people out. Marlow could not erase any of that. What the dog gave him was something quieter, a steady presence, a reason to stay in the moment, and enough courage to answer one call he had avoided for far too long. Maybe grace reaches us that way sometimes, not by changing the past, but by placing someone beside us while we learn how to move forward. If there is a call, a conversation, or a small step you have been putting off, perhaps today is a good day to begin. Tell us what Callum and Marlow's story meant to you in the comments. If stories like this bring a little hope into your day, consider sharing this one and subscribing to the channel. May you have the courage to answer what matters, and may peace meet you on the way.